Welcome to one of the most chilling tales to come out of the Ozark Mountains. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time of day or night you're listening. It's always fascinating to see when and where these stories reach people. The year was 1884. While much of America surged ahead into an age of factories and railroads, the rugged valleys of the Ozarks remained frozen in time. Tucked deep in the ridges of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, families lived in near isolation, their lives shaped more by the wilderness than by progress. In the misty hills of southwestern Missouri, roughly 40 miles from Springfield, near what would one day become Branson, there lay a nameless settlement absent from any official map. Locals whispered of it only as the Basin, and it was here that one of the darkest chapters in American history quietly took root, buried in county records for nearly 80 years before being unearthed. The first trace of the Blackwood family appears in an 1851 census, showing Josiah Blackwood, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children arriving from Tennessee. They gave a vague explanation, claiming they sought solitude for religious reasons, which was common enough at the time to avoid suspicion. A lone church record in Hollister mentions their arrival, noting they seemed peculiar but steadfast in faith. What seemed ordinary then would later take on a far more sinister meaning. The Blackwoods settled in a secluded hollow, reachable only by a narrow trail that snaked through oak and hickory forests and across dangerous ravines carved by centuries of rushing water. Land deeds filed at the Greene County Courthouse show Josiah bought 156 acres for an unusually low price from a man named Ezekiel Porter. The sale included a small cabin and a half-built barn, but Porter abandoned it all in haste. A cryptic note scribbled in the margin of the deed reads, "Porter claimed Hollow was wrong somehow. Payment accepted despite incompletion of terms." That strange line, discovered in 1952 by researcher Dr. James Harrington, marked the first recorded hint that something about the Basin carried a deeper unease. A year later, Harrington traced a death certificate to Sacramento, California, dated 1852, for an Ezekiel Porter who reportedly fled a place in Missouri known as the Devil's Own Hollow. Though not confirmed as the same man, the timing and details strongly suggest a connection. Whatever Porter experienced in that hollow was disturbing enough to drive him across the continent. The Blackwoods, however, remained, and though they caused little concern among the few neighbors who occasionally crossed their path, the shadow of what was to come already lingered over the valley. Josiah Blackwood appeared in many accounts as the image of a stern frontier patriarch, a bearded and taciturn man who relied on no one but himself. In a letter dated September 1852, traveling minister Reverend Thaddeus Wilson recalled meeting him on the road to Hollister. The Reverend described a man of imposing stature, with a serious demeanor, who introduced himself simply as Blackwood. When Wilson offered to visit his family and lead them in prayer, Josiah declined politely but firmly, explaining that his household kept their own faith in their own way. On the frontier, such independence in worship was not unusual, but what set the Blackwoods apart was how steadily they withdrew from even the most casual ties with the community. By 1855, Josiah's visits to town had dropped from monthly to quarterly, and by 1860, he came only twice a year, often alone, or with his grown sons. By 1884, the family's homestead had expanded far beyond its original cabin. Tax records detail a central house surrounded by 3 smaller cabins, a barn smokehouse and outbuildings, along with cultivated fields, an apple orchard, and a spring for water. A hand-drawn map from 1880 shows the layout, marking the property as a self-sufficient enclave. That October, heavy rains washed out the only access road, setting off a chain of events that would reveal what some later called a hidden society with its own unfathomable rules. The Blackwood land lay in a natural depression, walled in by steep ridges rising more than 800 feet, a box canyon with a single narrow entry along Stillwater Creek. The terrain formed a natural fortress, cutting the family off from outside eyes. But the unsettling truth was what that long isolation had shaped them into. In his unpublished 1953 study titled Isolated Communities of the American Interior, Dr. James Harrington described the Blackwood Basin as pathologically perfect for a closed society. His recovered field notes included sketches of the land and observations about its strange silence. He noted that sound rarely carried beyond the ridges, while noise from outside hardly entered, creating a sense of sensory imprisonment. Folklorist Vance Randolph, in his 1933 Ozark Mountain Tales, recorded earlier settler stories that the basin was a place where sounds never seemed to belong. He dismissed those tales as superstition, but Harrington saw in them a clue that the land itself contributed to the haunting aura surrounding the Blackwoods. What we know about life inside the Blackwood homestead comes mainly from three sources. First, the Journal of Margaret Blackwood, discovered in 1943 during renovations at the Greene County Courthouse, where it had somehow been misfiled with property deeds. Second, testimony from Postmaster Elias Whitmore, given to Missouri State Police in November 1884. And third, the chilling medical examiner's reports written after what would later be remembered only as the intervention, taken together with scattered letters and county records. These fragments allow us to piece together a picture of a family whose world slowly drifted beyond the bounds of ordinary human society. Margaret's journal begins innocently enough. A pioneer wife recording the daily struggles of carving a home from the wilderness. She wrote of clearing land, planting crops, and offering food to the rare travelers who passed through the valley. In April 1852, she noted, "Josiah believes we have found our Eden. Here, away from the corrupting influence of towns and false churches, we may raise our children according to the true word." Her words make it clear that religious separation drove them into the Ozarks, but the details of their faith remain uncertain. What becomes clear is that Josiah carried with him more than the family Bible. Margaret mentions repeatedly that he studied the old books, which he believed revealed the truth about the patriarchs, a truth ignored by the churches of his day. Whether these were apocryphal writings, forgotten commentaries, or something stranger, they shaped the doctrine that governed the Blackwood household. Around 1857, the tone of the journal begins to change. Mentions of neighbors and travelers fade away, replaced by accounts of Josiah tightening his grip on the family. "Josiah forbids the children from speaking to travelers now," Margaret wrote in June of that year. "He says the outside world carries corruption in its very breath." By 1860, no references to outsiders appear at all, as though the family had sealed itself off completely. Alongside this growing isolation came a shift in their worship. Early entries speak of prayer and Bible readings, but by 1858, Margaret was recording new practices. "Josiah has taken to leading the family in what he calls the old worship," she wrote that September. "The children must stand in a circle while he reads from his private book and marks their foreheads with ash. I fear this is not the Christianity we brought with us from Tennessee." These words foreshadow the strange and troubling rituals that would later draw the attention of authorities and cement the Blackwoods' reputation as something more than just an isolated frontier family. The most disturbing shift in Margaret Blackwood's journal begins in 1861, when her eldest daughter Rebecca was about 16. "Josiah has announced that Rebecca is to be joined soon," she wrote. When Margaret asked to whom Josiah, looked at her as if the question itself were nonsense. "To the family, of course, as it was in the beginning," he said. She admitted she did not understand, but his eyes frightened her into silence. Later entries circle back to this joining without ever stating plainly what it meant. By 1863, Margaret's words show she had begun to realize something terrible was happening. What Josiah calls purity I can no longer recognize as such, she confessed. The children born now carry the mark of our sin in their very flesh. Yet he says this is proof of divine favor that we are returning to the original state before the world was corrupted. These words suggest that by then, the effects of generations of inbreeding were showing in the newborns. By 1884, the family had multiplied far beyond the 3 children who first arrived in the Ozarks. Baptismal records from Hollister reveal that Margaret bore 7 more children after settling in the basin, the last recorded birth in 1863. Curiously, Josiah brought each newborn to be baptized, but stopped doing so after that year. No one knows why. Just as troubling, not a single marriage involving a Blackwood child was ever registered in Missouri or Arkansas. That absence would later become the thread investigators pulled to unravel the family's dark secret. Even the baptismal records hint at something unusual. Besides several entries, ministers left notes such as, "Child appears unwell," or "Infant shows unusual features." In 1862, one minister wrote, "Requested medical attention for the child, which the father refused." May God have mercy on this family. These remarks suggest that signs of genetic deformity were obvious enough to draw outside concern, even during Josiah's increasingly rare contact with the community. The most detailed outsider account came from Elias Whitmore Hollister's postmaster from 1855 until his death in 1892. In testimony given to state investigators, in November 1884, he described the family's visits to town. They came only 3 or 4 times a year, hauling wagons full of ginseng root animal pelts and odd hand-carved objects that sold easily to tourists at the new health spas. They kept to themselves, Whitmore said. Josiah did all the talking. The women, and there were several, never spoke a word in all the years I knew them. They kept their faces hidden under bonnets, even in the height of summer heat. Whitmore also noted that Josiah collected mail, but never sent letters, suggesting the Blackwoods had cut every line of communication with the outside world. Whitmore later recalled that Josiah would always ask if there was any mail for the name Blackwood, but there never was, not once in nearly 30 years. When pressed to describe the women who accompanied him, Whitmore grew hesitant. There were resemblances, he finally admitted. More resemblances than there ought to have been, if you take my meaning. His words suggested more than he was willing to put plainly. Thomas Gardner, who ran the general store in Hollister, echoed the same unease. The old man Josiah, he aged like anyone else, Gardner testified. But the women with him there was a sameness that wasn't natural. Year after year, they looked too much alike, if you understand me. When investigators asked him to clarify, Gardner only shook his head. "I'm a God-fearing man. I don't like to speak ill without certainty, but there weren't enough different faces among them for how many there were." Store records preserved in the Taney County Historical Society back up Gardner's testimony. The Blackwoods bought flour salt ammunition and tools like anyone else, but they also purchased striking amounts of medicinal supplies, laudanum, camphor, and various patent remedies. In 1876, Josiah bought 6 bottles of Dr. Wilton's quieting syrup for nervous conditions, a concoction heavy with morphine. Such purchases suggest attempts to dull pain or treat chronic ailments, possibly linked to the abnormalities later documented by medical examiners. The breaking point came in October 1884, when the Ozarks were struck by nearly a week of unrelenting rain. Meteorological records call it the heaviest rainfall since observations began in 1837, with more than 15 inches in some areas. Stillwater Creek burst its banks. The trail into the Blackwood Basin collapsed and landslides sealed the valley off even further. When Josiah failed to appear for his usual supplies. In In early November, Gardner mentioned it casually to Sheriff Robert Ledbetter. The sheriff dismissed it. At first, those mountain folk go months without showing their faces, he reportedly said. But concern turned urgent on December 3rd, when a hunting party led by James Holloway wandered into the basin by accident. Holloway's written statement, still preserved in county records, describes how the men encountered a young woman in a torn nightdress despite the freezing air. She was filthy barefoot and trembling, unable or unwilling to speak. Without a word, she led them toward the Blackwood property, then suddenly bolted into the trees. From a distance, Holloway and his men glimpsed figures moving around the homestead in a way that struck them all as peculiar and troubling. His statement goes on to describe the young woman in unsettling detail. Her eyes set unnaturally wide, her jaw thrust forward, her hands twisted with fingers of uneven length, physical features consistent with severe genetic disorders. Most unsettling of all was the way the young woman moved. Holloway described her gait as shuffling, her knees turned inward as if her very bones had not formed correctly. Such clinical detail was unusual for a woodsman in 1884. But Holloway had studied medicine briefly at Washington University in St. Louis before returning home to manage his family's timber business. His account also notes a behavior that would later shed light on the family's isolation. The woman was not only terrified of the men, she seemed terrified of the forest itself. She glanced constantly at the trees, as though she expected them to come alive. Holloway concluded this was the reaction of someone who had never left confinement, to whom the open world was as strange and overwhelming as another planet might be to us. Holloway's statement spurred Sheriff Robert Ledbetter into action. On December 4, 1884, he assembled what official records called a party of concerned citizens himself. 2 deputies, county physician, Dr. Elias Porter, and 4 armed men from local families. The October floods had washed out much of the trail, forcing them to leave their horses nearly 2 miles from the basin and continue on foot through mud, rock, and tangled undergrowth. What they found on December 5th was recorded in the sheriff's official report with careful detachment. But Deputy Sheriff William Hayes kept a private journal discovered only after his death in 1912, and his words convey what the official record could not. The main house stood at the center of what I can only describe as a compound, Hayes wrote. Figures watched us from the windows of the cabins, silent as stones, their stares following us like rifle sights. Then came the smell, filth, spoiled food, and something else I cannot rightly name. Something foul beyond description. The party pressed on in silence until the door of the main house opened. Out stepped Josiah Blackwood. He looked impossibly aged, his beard white and trailing nearly to his waist, his skin cracked and weathered like tanned hide. He showed neither fear nor surprise at the sight of the armed men. Instead, Hayes recalled he regarded them with the detached curiosity one might show an insect crawling across the floor. Sheriff Ledbetter explained their purpose, that reports of a woman in distress had compelled them to investigate. Josiah's only reply was a thin smile that Hayes described as enough to turn his blood cold. "My family suffers no distress," the old man said evenly. "We are as God made us and as God wants us to be." Hayes's journal records the interior of the main house in unsettling detail. The upper floor, instead of being divided into proper bedrooms, had been arranged into narrow cells, each secured from the outside with wooden bars. Inside were crude pallets, some marked by ropes, and leather straps fastened to the walls. But the most disturbing room lay at the center of the house, larger than the rest, where Margaret Blackwood was found. She sat surrounded by a grotesque parody of feminine comfort. Faded ribbons hung from the ceiling, crude drawings of flowers covered the walls, and corn-husked dolls, eerily childlike, stood arranged in a semicircle around her bed. The official report reduced this discovery to a single line: 27 individuals of varying ages living in conditions of extreme squalor and moral degradation. Hayes's private account reveals what that language concealed. The inhabitants bore clear signs of shared bloodlines across generations where separation should have existed. Many showed malformed skulls, twisted limbs, and asymmetrical features. Some could not speak at all, making only guttural animal noises when approached. Most disturbing of all were the unmistakable indications of relationships that defied every natural law and human taboo. When questioned, those capable of speech offered no names beyond Blackwood. They called Josiah father regardless of their own age or appearance, leaving investigators unable to untangle whether the term meant patriarch, spiritual figure, or direct parent. Hayes wrote that the very concept of relation seemed to have collapsed into a single identity, as though names and roles had ceased to matter within the closed world of the basin. The smaller cabins revealed further glimpses into this insular society. One housed only women and girls, ranging from young children to middle age, all silently engaged in weaving, sewing, and crafting the strange corn-husk dolls. Another served as a crude school where chalkboards displayed biblical passages alongside unsettling anatomical sketches focused on human reproduction. The third was a nursery containing 7 infants and small children. They were attended by 2 women, so alike in face and form, they seemed twins, though one bore the unmistakable wear of years. Dr. Elias Porter, the county physician, brought to examine the family, concealed much in his official findings, omitting details out of consideration for public sensibility. But his private journal, recovered after his suicide in 1887, left no such restraint. I have observed in these subjects physical and apparent mental degeneration that can only result from sustained breeding among close blood relations, he wrote. Some individuals show such extreme abnormalities that I question whether they may even be classified within known medical taxonomy. Porter's notes describe cranial deformities, asymmetrical faces, extra fingers and toes, and skeletal malformations too severe to mistake for chance. Most chilling are his attempts to map the family's lineage. Subject 14, a female between 16 and 18 years old, he wrote, shows characteristics suggesting she is both daughter and granddaughter to Subject 1, Josiah Blackwood. Porter's private notes detail relationships so tangled they defy comprehension. Subject 7, a male of about 30, appeared to be both son and half-brother to Subject 14, while also being at once the son and grandson of Josiah himself. The physician concluded that the Blackwood lineage had become a labyrinth of interwoven bloodlines, sustained over generations until distinctions between parent, sibling, and child had all but collapsed. His journal further records the medical toll of this practice. Seizure disorders, developmental delays, and weakened immune systems were common. Many bore untreated respiratory infections and festering skin conditions. Porter's assessment was stark. The Blackwood line had entered a stage of terminal decline. If continued, their practices would render future generations non-viable. Amid these observations, one detail stood out. Porter wrote of a book, a manuscript always kept in Josiah's possession. It was leather-bound, filled with writing in a script he could not identify as any known language. Josiah grew animated whenever it was mentioned, insisting it contained the original truth from before the corruption. No one else was allowed to touch it. The book was never recovered, vanishing during the chaotic removal of the family, and its origin remains one of the lingering mysteries of the Blackwood case. By 1884, Josiah was nearing 70. To those who questioned him, he showed no recognition that his household defied the most basic human norms. Sheriff Ledbetter testified that when told he was under arrest, Josiah's only response was bewilderment. For what crime? This is my family. This is our way. Hayes's journal captures the unsettling logic Josiah offered. He spoke with conviction about purifying the bloodline, of returning to the ways of the biblical patriarchs, and of his family as a chosen remnant, preserving what the rest of the world had forsaken. Most disturbing was his pride. He pointed to the twisted features of his descendants not as evidence of decay, but as proof of perfection restored. In his own words, Josiah described what he called the circles of joining rituals, binding each new generation back to the older ones in what he believed was a sacred cycle. When asked if he understood that these practices were causing the deformities so plain to see, he dismissed the question outright. "These are not defects," he declared. "They are the original form before the world was corrupted." Josiah Blackwood seemed incapable of grasping the misery his practices had inflicted on his descendants. Margaret, now in her 60s, was found bedridden in an upstairs chamber, her mind broken and her eyes vacant. Dr. Porter noted her condition as advanced senility far beyond her years, perhaps the result of long-term trauma or the crushing toll of isolation. Her journal later recovered stops abruptly in 1869, as if her lucidity had slipped away long before the intervention. The final entry, written in a faltering hand, reads, "The children have children now. Josiah says this is how we remain pure. God help me. I no longer know what purity means." Earlier passages reveal a woman struggling against her husband's tightening grip. In 1865, she wrote, "I tried to send Rebecca away when the traitor came. Josiah found out. He has taken her to the cave. When they return, she will be changed like the others." The cave appears repeatedly in her writing, always in connection with punishment or transformation. Yet no such feature was recorded in the official survey of the property. Later researchers speculated that one of the surrounding ridges concealed it, serving both as a prison and as the site of Josiah's rituals. By 1867, Margaret's entries show a tragic collapse of her resistance. "I helped prepare Sarah today. I told her it was a blessing. As Josiah insists, I showed her the marks to make and the words to say. May God forgive me for this lie. There is no blessing in what we do, only the continuation of something that should have ended long ago." Whether coerced or broken, Margaret had become a participant in the very practices she once feared. For the authorities, the immediate problem was untangling the relationships of the family itself. Many of the younger members could not speak. Those who could offered contradictory answers. Porter attempted to construct a family chart sketching pages of connections, but abandoned the effort in frustration. His final note described it as a spider's web rather than a tree. On December 12, 1884, Judge Thomas Wilson issued an order dispersing the dependents of the Blackwood clan to institutions where, in his words, they might receive care consistent with Christian charity. The phrasing was detached, but Hayes's journal captures the reality. He wrote of the courthouse filled with cries so piercing and strange they shook every soul who heard them. Less human than animal, he wrote, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of human grief. Hayes also recorded a troubling incident during this forced separation, an account absent from the official record. Official records describe one incident during the dispersal that was later omitted from public accounts. A young woman, identified as a daughter of Rebecca Josiah's eldest child, broke free from officers escorting her to the transport wagon. Instead of fleeing, she rushed back toward the courthouse where Josiah was being held, screaming in a language no one could recognize. When restrained, she bit down on her own tongue until blood poured from her mouth, yet still tried to form words that seemed to be directed at the patriarch. From inside his cell, Josiah answered in the same strange tongue. Witnesses noted how his voice carried a commanding authority that immediately calmed her. She fell silent and returned quietly to the wagon without further struggle. To those present, the moment suggested that Josiah's hold over his descendants extended beyond ordinary influence, something deeper, almost unearthly. Josiah was remanded to the Missouri State Asylum in St. Louis, where he died 3 months later. The records show he never admitted wrongdoing. Physicians noted that until his final days, he insisted, "The world will one day understand the purity I have achieved." The rest of the family was scattered across institutions and orphanages. Many died within a few years, their bodies unable to withstand life outside the basin. The youngest children were given new names in an effort to integrate them into normal society. But reports suggest most struggled with both their health and their ability to adapt. The asylum notes on Josiah himself are especially chilling. Dr. Ambrose Wilcox, his attending physician, observed that despite his age and years of primitive living, Josiah displayed surprising erudition on ancient religious practices and genealogical theory. In their conversations, he expounded on what he called the science of blood purity, quoting obscure religious texts and citing historical precedents with the fluency of a formally educated man, a detail not found anywhere in the family's recorded history. When confronted with the obvious suffering and deformities of his descendants, Josiah dismissed them as transitional forms, necessary steps toward what he described as final perfection. He showed no recognition of pain, no sense of moral failing. To him, the Blackwood family represented not decay, but the dawn of a higher order of mankind. Dr. Wilcox concluded that Josiah suffered from a profound delusional disorder, hardened by decades of isolation and absolute power within his household. Josiah's death on March 17, 1885, was recorded as pneumonia complicated by general debility, a common cause among elderly asylum inmates. A final note in his file reads simply that he refused all medication during his illness, telling attendants, "The pure do not require the mixtures of the corrupted." Josiah Blackwood was laid to rest in the asylum cemetery, his grave unmarked and unattended. No family came to witness the interment. The final note in his file records that, in his last hours, he wrote ceaselessly in the strange language no one could identify, scrawling on scraps of paper the walls of his cell, and finally on his own skin when all else was taken from him. If any of these writings were preserved, they have never been made available to researchers. What makes the Blackwood case so notable is not only the grotesque reality uncovered in 1884, but the silence that followed. Within months of the intervention, official records began to vanish from county archives. Newspapers that had initially sensationalized the story dropped it without explanation. By 1886, it was as though the Blackwoods had never existed. Surviving correspondence between Sheriff Ledbetter and Judge Wilson, preserved by Ledbetter's grandson and released in 1961, reveals why. "I concur that public knowledge of the full circumstances can serve no beneficial purpose," Ledbetter wrote in February 1885. "The reputation of our county and state would suffer unduly from association with such abnormality. Moreover, those innocents who might yet be saved from their heritage deserve protection from the stigma of their origins." This reasoning suggested a mixture of civic pride and paternalistic concern. But later historians questioned whether those were the only motives. In the 1960s, researcher Eleanor Pruitt uncovered letters between Judge Wilson and prominent Missouri families hinting at something darker. A note from Wilson to State Senator Thaddeus Crawford, dated April 1885, contained the cryptic assurance, "The matter we discussed regarding certain mountain folk has been resolved with complete discretion. All those with knowledge have been sworn to secrecy, and records are being handled appropriately. You may assure our mutual associates that no connection will ever be established." Some took this as evidence that the Blackwoods' isolation may not have been absolute, and that alliances or blood ties with more respectable families had to be concealed. Dr. James Harrington's 1953 investigation ran headlong into these walls of silence. He noted repeated denials of access to files that should have been public record and elderly residents of Hollister who changed the subject or claimed no knowledge whenever the case was raised. In one instance, an elderly woman began to recount childhood memories of the Hollow people before her son stormed in and ended the interview. Harrington concluded, "There appears to be a concerted effort to erase this incident from historical memory, yet his persistence yielded a chilling discovery." He found Jacob Weaver, a former asylum orderly, then in his 90s, who had attended Josiah during his confinement. Weaver described the old man with words that still unsettle. He wasn't like the other patients. He had a power about him, even locked in that ward. Weaver's recollections painted Josiah as more than a delusional patriarch. The other inmates would do whatever he told them, he recalled. Even some of the staff seemed to fall under his influence. Dr. Wilcox spent hours with him writing like a student before a professor. After Josiah's death, Wilcox changed noticeably. Withdrawn and consumed with genealogy and ancient religion, he resigned 6 months later and vanished. Rumors suggested he went west to start a community of his own, though no record of his later life has ever been found. If true, it would mean Josiah's influence extended beyond his family and out into the wider world, leaving behind more than twisted bloodlines, perhaps leaving disciples. Harrington's fieldwork in the 1950s deepened the mystery. On the old Blackwood property, he found a burial ground marked only with crude wooden stakes bearing initials and clustered dates: 1862, 1870, 1877. These suggested waves of deaths, whether from disease ritual or other causes, no one could say. He collected soil samples and sent them to Washington University, but the results were never published. His letters from this period grew increasingly paranoid. He wrote of being followed on lonely Ozark back roads, of strangers watching him in hotel lobbies. In March 1957, he wrote to his department chair at the University of Chicago, "I am now convinced that the Blackwood case represents something more than an isolated instance of degeneracy. The systematic suppression of records, the refusal of locals to speak even 70 years later, and certain physical evidence I have uncovered suggest a phenomenon with deeper historical roots and possibly wider geographic distribution." He speculated that local authorities had known of the Blackwood situation long before the 1884 intervention, and that other enclaves may have existed or may still exist in the remote hills of the Ozarks. His notes mentioned 2 sites under investigation, one along the Buffalo River in Arkansas, another in the far reaches of eastern Oklahoma. In both places, he found the same signs: communities cut off from the outside world, unusual religious rites, and locals unwilling to speak. There appears to be a shared origin to these cases, Harrington wrote. Either a common ideological source or direct connections between them, but his theory never advanced further. In April 1957, Harrington traveled to Springfield to meet an unnamed source who claimed to possess sealed Blackwood records. He never returned. His car was found abandoned at a roadside rest area on Highway 60, barely 30 miles from the site of the old Blackwood homestead. He has never been seen again. The official investigation into Dr. Harrington's disappearance was closed after 6 weeks without conclusions. His research materials, which might have been the most comprehensive account of the Blackwood case ever compiled, were reported destroyed in a fire that consumed his university office the very night he vanished. The timing to many was too convenient to dismiss fueling theories that his work was deliberately erased. A curious footnote surfaced in 1963 when a hiker in the Mark Twain National Forest discovered a battered notebook wedged in a crevice near the old Blackwood property. It was confirmed as Harrington's. The entries dated April 15, 1957, days after his official disappearance. In fragmented handwriting, he described meeting with his anonymous source, who had shown him documents implicating the highest levels of Missouri's government in suppressing the Blackwood affair. The final entry, water-damaged and incomplete, is chilling, found the cave. Matches running low. Strange markings on walls similar to JB's book. Someone else has been here recently, I hear. The words end there. The last major documented inquiry came in '65, when historian Eleanor Puitt attempted to trace the lives of the family members dispersed to state institutions. Her findings, published in a little red academic journal that soon folded, suggested that several of the younger Blackwood women bore children while institutionalized. These children, adopted out under new identities, vanished into the broader population. The disturbing possibility exists, Puitt wrote, that descendants of the Blackwood lineage have been unknowingly integrated into society, carrying forward genetic material shaped by generations of isolation and inbreeding. Like Harrington, Puitt ran into obstacles, sealed files, missing records, and archival purges that always seemed to touch on the case. She concluded her article with a question that still lingers: was the erasure of the Blackwoods from history an act of mercy, protecting innocence from stigma? Or was it driven by a deeper unwillingness to confront the evidence that such extremes of human corruption could emerge in the American past? Her most startling discovery was evidence of an anonymous trust established in 1886, just 2 years after the intervention. Its funds were designated for the long-term care of certain numbered patients in Missouri institutions. Puitt's research suggested those patients were almost certainly Blackwood survivors. The source of the trust remains unknown, but its existence points to someone with wealth and influence who not only ensured the family's quiet upkeep, but perhaps guaranteed their continued isolation from public view. The trust, established in 1886, reportedly continued to dispense funds until 1932, when the last of the original beneficiaries is believed to have died. Eleanor Puitt's investigation into the Blackwood affair ended abruptly in late 1965, when she accepted a university position in Australia and abandoned her research without explanation. Colleagues later recalled that she had grown visibly anxious in the weeks before her departure, claiming she had received anonymous warnings to leave the matter alone. No evidence of such threats has ever surfaced, yet her sudden retreat fits the larger pattern researchers who pursued the Blackwood case often stopped short, whether by disappearance, resignation, or fear. One thread neither Puitt nor Harrington fully developed was the case's eerie connection to older regional folklore. Vance Randolph's collection of Ozark traditions mentions stories of hollow folk or hidden people said to dwell in remote valleys and cling to forgotten ways long abandoned by the rest of society. Randolph dismissed these tales as typical superstition, but the parallels to the Blackwood family are striking. If such stories were circulating before 1851, the Blackwoods may not have been originators at all, but inheritors or revivers of something far older. This possibility found a strange echo in archaeology. In 1962, Robert Chambers conducted a survey of the Mark Twain National Forest and documented remnants of earlier settlements in secluded valleys. Some of these structures predated European arrival, yet evidence suggested they were inhabited well into the 19th century. Chambers speculated that certain pioneer families might have merged with these older groups instead of displacing them. More unsettling were his remarks about cultural practices that did not match any known settler community. He did not elaborate, but his report included photographs of carvings found on rock faces, symbols unlike native petroglyphs or frontier graffiti. These markings formed geometric designs and stylized human figures arranged in rings. Chambers wrote that they might represent a ritual calendar or an astronomical system, but the imagery bore an uncanny resemblance to the circles of joining Josiah Blackwood described during questioning. Whether coincidence or continuity, the suggestion is unavoidable. The basin where the Blackwoods built their compound may have been chosen for reasons deeper than chance. A place long associated with secret traditions beyond the bounds of ordinary society. Today the site has been reclaimed by wilderness, the cabins rotted away, and the trails overgrown. The Ozark forest has swallowed the last traces of the Blackwoods. Yet the story remains fragmentary, suppressed, half-buried in folklore and rumors still whispering that some histories, however, carefully erased, refuse to stay silent. By 1960, aerial surveys revealed nothing but forest, where the Blackwood homestead had once stood. The cabins, barns, and crude outbuildings were gone, the access road reclaimed by the wilderness. In 1968, the land was absorbed into the Mark Twain National Forest, its location designated an ecological research zone closed to the public. Officially, the restriction served environmental purposes. Unofficially, it fueled decades of speculation that the government still sought to conceal evidence tied to the Blackwoods. In 1997, a Forest Service employee, speaking on condition of anonymity, admitted that certain parts of the forest were off-limits even to staff citing only sensitive research projects. He offered no details. Whether connected to the Blackwood Basin or not, the secrecy added to the legend. Today, what remains of the Blackwood case survives less in official documents than in whispers, references to basin people or hollow folk that resurface from time to time in Ozark folklore, stripped of names but echoing with familiarity. Every so often, a fragment of evidence emerges. In 2003, renovation workers at the old Taney County Courthouse discovered a sealed metal box hidden within a wall. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the Blackwood property, marked with strange symbols resembling those from Chambers's archaeological survey. The map bore no date or signature. On the reverse, in faded script, were 5 words: "Let this place be forgotten." The map was transferred to the Missouri State Archives, where it reportedly sits under restricted access, available only to select researchers. The most disturbing coda came decades earlier in 1969, when highway construction near Branson unearthed a cave containing human remains, at least 7 skeletons each, showing the same deformities Dr. Porter described in 1884. Carbon dating placed them between 1865 and 1870, aligning precisely with Margaret Blackwood's cryptic journal entries about family members taken to the cave. The arrangement of the bones was even more unsettling. They had been placed in a circle around a crude altar of stacked stones. Local newspapers gave the discovery only brief mention before the remains were transferred to the State Archaeological Department. No report was ever published. Inquiries years later were met with vague explanations that the remains had been misplaced during a reorganization. And so, the pattern repeated itself. Evidence revealed, then swiftly buried, until nothing remained but silence. In 1998, a graduate student in forensic anthropology at the University of Missouri claimed to have rediscovered some of the Blackwood remains tucked away in an unlabeled storage container. Her preliminary notes described deformities consistent with prolonged inbreeding cranial malformations, evidence of polydactyly details that echoed Dr. Porter's century-old observations. But before her research could be completed, the bones were seized by the State Archaeological Department and vanished once again into obscurity. Her advisor quietly warned her away from the subject, citing political sensitivities. And so, like every attempt before, another chance to shine light on the Blackwood legacy slipped into silence. The case endures as a dark reminder of how easily an entire community can be erased from historical memory, when its reality challenges our deepest assumptions about family, faith, and civilization. It raises questions that reach far beyond the Ozarks. What other stories lie hidden in forgotten archives, sealed away in institutional records, or buried in the remote hollows of America's vast interior? What other communities, isolated and unseen, might have grown in directions we dare not imagine? The ridges of the Ozarks give nothing away. To the casual hiker, the valleys are silent, the forests untouched. Locals still offer wary smiles when outsiders ask too many questions about the old days. Some stories, it seems, are not meant to be told. Some hollows are better left unexplored. Yet fragments remain in brittle documents, in fading folklore. Perhaps even in the bloodlines of people who walk among us with no knowledge of their ancestry. The Blackwood case is more than an historical curiosity. It is a testament to what can happen when isolation becomes absolute. It shows us how cut off from the larger world, human society can bend, break, and remake itself into something both alien and familiar, a reflection of our own nature distorted in the dark. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is not what we know of the Blackwoods, but what remains unknown. Lost records, silenced witnesses, suppressed evidence, and unanswered questions. Perhaps that uncertainty is a kind of mercy. The forest has long since reclaimed the Blackwood Basin. The cabins are gone, the gravestones swallowed by vines, and the road itself erased from the land. But the questions linger. They echo through the misty hollows carried on the wind that rustles the ancient trees, questions about the fragility of human boundaries, about what we become when we turn inward too far, about what we dare to remember and what we choose to forget. And if somewhere in the winding bloodlines of America a trace of the Blackwoods endures, then perhaps forgetting was never truly an option. As night falls over the Ozarks, the shadows lengthen, and the wind through the valleys carries whispers that sound unnervingly like voices reminding us that the past is never as distant as we'd like to believe.